Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in. So for today's video, I thought that I would share a little story about myself and who I thought that I was in college. So when I was a sophomore in college, I took a music class because I was really interested in music. Obviously, I have been my entire life. However, I didn't want to study music. I didn't want it to become something that was like unabstract and sort of more clinical through study. So instead I studied communications, but I took the class because I had room for electives and it seemed fun. So it was music history. And essentially it started from Gregorian chant and went all the way up until the end of the Baroque era. So at the end of the class, we were all tasked on writing an 8 to 12 page paper as our final. And I thought that I was just the absolute man when it came to writing papers, especially about topics that I like, including music. I thought that I was the absolute doctor of all doctors when it came to writing papers. I really truly believe that the thesis that I wrote for this small town college elective course music class was going to change the way that people looked at music forever. I was going to single-handedly save the music of the old days of yore with this incredible paper that I wrote. Obviously none of that happened, but it's a fun story. I think the paper was at least interesting, so I'm going to talk about it. I no longer have the paper, so I'm working very much off memory. I lost it when I got locked out of my college account. However, I remember basically what I was doing is I was taking the three movements of music from like Baroque, Victorian, and something else. Baroque, Victorian, and I guess Renaissance, something along those lines. And I was comparing it to the movements of rock and roll in the 20th century. And I know what you're thinking. Grungy Lemon. That's crazy. That is insane. You have to be either a madman or an absolute genius to come up with such an idea. And I completely agree. I really truly believe I was the pinnacle of the music history student, solving the cyclical nature of how music moves in one foul swoop in this end of term paper. So I'm not going to pretend that I remember everything about every musical movement that happened in centuries past. That that information has long sort of left my brain in any sort of capacity that I could comfortably talk about it. But I remember that essentially what I was doing is I sort of compared how those music movements sort of lined up with metal, punk, and grunge music. And it was pretty interesting if I remember correctly. I definitely used, I think maybe the Baroque was punk, just because of the raw emotional influence that had sort of infiltrated after so much like clinical sort of music, which I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, was sort of the case when it came to exiting what was, mostly religious themed music and entering more contemporary sort of tunes that could just be played at any time for any occasion. That might not be Baroque, but like that was a comparison I made with punk and metal. Metal, I sort of focused on how it was really based upon, like scales. It's almost like jazz in a way, but metal is very sort of meticulously crafted. A lot of metal songs have different movements in them the same way that you would see in sort of classical pieces, so I definitely kind of played into that. That was really the role that I played, and I do believe that that holds up actually. I don't remember which old musical form I was comparing each newer form to exactly, but I do remember metal was very centered upon skill and technique, which I do believe holds true. I think in metal music, possibly more than like any other rock genre for sure, except maybe like prog rock or certain like math rock bands like Tool. I think a lot of those, what you would call metal bands, it's sort of inherently you have to have the technique, to be able to shred and come up with all these different solos and riffs that sort of defines metal as a genre. You need that technique, so that was kind of what I focused on there. Now, grunge, I've always been a subscriber of the philosophy that grunge is kind of like punk music with metal undertones. I also believe it's definitely on the spectrum. I would argue that while not my favorite of grunge bands, I think fucking Pearl Jam. I think Pearl Jam is what you would maybe call quintessential grunge, and I think Soundgarden is sort of the antithesis of that, to where it's more experimental grunge. But the spectrum that I'm interested in kind of has more to do with two other mainstream grunge bands, being Nirvana and Alice in Chains, where I think, again, grunge being punk music with metal undertones, and I think it's sort of a spectrum where on the really metal heavy side you have Alice in Chains, because grunge was nothing more than just a big conglomeration of a bunch of different bands that the media didn't know how to label, so they called them all grunge bands. So you have sort of Alice in Chains on the very metal heavy side, and on the punk side you kind of have like Nirvana and other bands like that. I would say Screaming Trees, maybe even Green River, bands like that that sort of fell in the more punk side of what we call grunge. And that was really what I focused on with whatever I compared to grunge music, just sort of how genres were blending, and out of different musical movements of the past, people take influence from different places and create something almost wholly new, which in 1990, 1991, grunge was like wholly new. It seems unthinkable to think of today, with all the influence that these different bands have, spilling over even still, but it was incredibly new at one time. So, yeah, that was the paper I wrote, and again, I really thought that I was just an absolute genius. It never once occurred to me that maybe things just happened the way that they did, and I don't have all the answers. But at the time, sophomore in college, grungy lemon, definitely had it all figured out. So that's pretty much it for today. If you have anything to say about anything that I said, just leave a comment. Thanks.